So again, good afternoon. Welcome to everybody who is just joining us online. We are very happy to welcome you to yet another BIONEXT webinar. This is the third in our series. And today we have a session on justice in biodiversity transformations based on the research that we've conducted in Finland, Belgium, and the Netherlands. And this work has been mostly conducted with my colleague Symke Nieboer and Thomas Fransen. Unfortunately, Thomas is ill with the flu today. And also a lot of other colleagues, some of whom are joining us in the room today, and their names are also on the screen. So this is very much also based on their efforts. And for today, we have a webinar of an hour and 15 minutes planned, with me welcoming you, as I'm doing right now. After that, we'll turn to Symke, who will share our presentation, the insights of the work that we've conducted on justice and biodiversity transformations. And after that, we get some reflections from our panel members, Lara Sibbing and Ida Simonsen, who have joined us today, who will reflect on the work we've done based on what they do in their daily life. I'll introduce them later on in this webinar. And after that, we have a question session or a Q&A session. So if questions pop up in the meantime, do throw them in the chat so we can turn to them later. And then my plan is to close this session at 3:15 so that we can get back to all the other things in our busy lives. Welcome to the last people dropping in, but let me get started with a brief introduction of our project. So this session, as I already mentioned, is part of the BIONEXT project, which is an EU-funded research and innovation project focused on understanding how transformative change towards nature-positive futures can unfold. And as you may see, we're in the last year of our project, which means that we're really coming into the kind of interesting conclusion phase. Hence, we have our webinar today, sharing some of our recommendations on justice. And the cases that we'll see today come from this broader work in the BIONEXT project that it really kind of builds on these two key concepts, which is transformative change and the biodiversity nexus. And the idea behind this is simple, but yet also very complex, is that biodiversity transitions never happen in isolation, but that they're always intertwined with food systems, climate systems, water, energy, health, transport. And that because these systems involve different actors, interests, and power relations, justice questions are really at the core of transformation. And the three cases that we talk about today, that we present our results of, really sit in the middle of this biodiversity nexus. But what we'll see is that they face similar justice tensions and similar kind of patterns in how transformation arises. But when we talk about transformative change, we often stay at a very high level, so talking really about systems and structures and long-term shifts. But transformation doesn't happen in the abstract. It doesn't happen in structures. It doesn't happen in these concepts. But it really unfolds in concrete processes, in real-life situations, in sectors and places. For example, in farming and forestry, or how we govern land and nature. And once change happens at that level, justice also immediately comes into play, because we're making decisions about what counts as a problem, what solutions are prioritized, who is involved, and who bears the costs or the benefits. And this is why justice is key for transformations, and we should really treat it as something at the core of transformation. And this is also the entry point for the analysis that Symke will present shortly. But before we turn to that analysis, I would like to get a feel of who is in the room. And I don't know if you've ever done this, but I'd like to do this through a chat storm. And what this means is that you type the answers and hold on in pressing enter, but you type the answers to these questions. And when I say go, everybody presses them at the same time. So please enter your name, your institute, or wherever you're based, plus what comes to mind when you hear justice in biodiversity transformations? So somebody is unmuted. So please type in your name and the institute or whatever organization or place that you're based at, and what comes to mind when you hear justice in biodiversity transformations. And I'll just wait a little second. Assuming people have written something down, filling in the void with words. And should we go ahead and press enter? I don't see any. Here's the first one. See, rivers with legal rights. Fair access to nature and their services for all population groups. Interconnection. Big words. Social ecological change. Climate change litigation. Uni multi-species. Oh, Helsinki Uni multi-species. See a lot of different associations already popping up with justice and biodiversity transformations. Well, hopefully today can serve as a way to color that a little bit in and to give you some idea about, what patterns at least we see or what we hear when we hear the words justice and biodiversity transformations from a transitions perspective. Still some things coming in, ensuring equal rights for both people and nature. Nice. I think a lot of things really touch on justice and biodiversity transformations. But thank you for sharing that. I also see people from a lot of different places and organizations. So welcome to all of you. Really happy to see you all. And now I would like to move to Symke.
Yes.
Yes,
thank
we
you.
can hear you. I will hand over to
Great.
Symke, who will share the insights from our work. Symke, over to you.
Thank you, Aniek. Hello, everyone. Today I will share our key insights and recommendations on justice in biodiversity transitions based on the work we have done over the last year. So the question central to this work was, how do justice dynamics unfold in biodiversity transformations? And secondly, what can we learn from that for transformative change? Before I dive into our findings, I want to situate where our findings come from. So our analysis draws on 3 empirical cases. You can see them here. So the first one is nature inclusive agriculture in the Netherlands. Then we have a second one on forestry and biodiversity policy in Finland. And we have a third case on nature-based healthcare in Belgium. So we analyzed both stakeholder perspectives through interviews and policy designs. And what's important to mention here is we're not comparing these 3 cases. We're really using all of them to identify reoccurring patterns in how justice is understood and enacted in biodiversity transitions. Yes, then here you can see our findings. I'll go through our findings by talking about these 4 recommendations and taking them one by one and sharing what patterns we actually found. So these recommendations are based on some of the tensions that we have identified in the 3 cases. So let's get started with the first one. So the first one is to make justice an explicit objective. So this builds on the pattern that appeared clearly across the 3 cases, where in the policies we analyzed, but also in the interviews that we did with stakeholders, justice was rarely articulated as an explicit goal of the transition. And so without this explicit articulation, what we see in practice is that justice is operationalized indirectly. So through ideas like feasibility, equal treatment and participation. So, for example, justice obligations in policies are often put into practice through uniformity. So this is framed as fair because no one is made a clear loser. But this is quite a narrow interpretation of justice because it does not take into account who benefits from change or who contributes most to ecological degradation or who has a greater capacity to act, for example. And so without a clear articulation or a reflection on justice as an objective for transition, the ideas of justice that surfaced in practice, we saw that they remained quite anthropocentric, so human-centered, and also ended up being these middle-of-the-road ideas with just back one. Yeah, thanks. So like a dominant emphasis on the economic viability of farmers and the forestry sector, regardless of who contributes most to the damage done. And then lastly, here we see that this also often resulted in biodiversity being merely an instrumentally framed thing in transition objectives. So not as an entity deserving of rights and justice, but more like as a means to an end. And some stakeholders also did express concern about this. For example, in the Belgian case, where some of the people stressed the risk of further commodifying nature without explicit inclusion of it. And so from a transition perspective, visions and objectives are key for governance because they help steer us into the right direction, and it also helps to create reference points against which we can assess our plans. So our first key recommendation is to make justice an explicit transition objective, because what is not articulated cannot be steered. And this doesn't mean to fix a single definition in advance, but more explicitly recognize it as something that requires ongoing discussion and governance over time. Then onto our second recommendation, which also directly builds onto the first one. What we see in both the Finnish and the Dutch cases is an implicit assumption that justice will be produced through participation itself. So what I mean by that is that if enough actors are consulted, involved, or invited to the table, then the outcome is assumed to be just, or at least just enough. And this is rarely stated explicitly in policy text, but it becomes visible in how participation is designed and what is expected to deliver. So participation is framed as a way to social acceptance or building legitimacy and buy-in, or to smooth the implementation process. But our stakeholder perspectives make the limits of this logic visible. First, because some emphasize that it's not that easy to get your voice heard in the first place, especially if your point of view is considered marginal or alternative. And secondly, if you look closely, participation is rarely designed as a space to ask the harder questions, such as who benefits from this transition, or who will bear the costs, whose knowledge counts, and who's the one that decides. So as a result, participation often reproduces the already existing power relations instead of challenging them. And so our point is not here that participation is bad, but that we should treat participation as a social learning process. So where justice questions are made visible and where they are discussed and negotiated. Continuing to our third recommendation. This third recommendation underscores the power of institutionally recognizing the roles that we would like to see in our future. And this links specifically back to the first recommendation on making justice explicit. yeah, in many biodiversity transition policies, biodiversity is increasingly included, which is good, through indicators, conditional payments, environmental requirements, or climate nature co-benefits. And there's an implicit belief that this instrumental inclusion will gradually turn everyone into a steward. But the problem is that this inclusion still operates through an older framing, where nature is seen as something to be managed or used, and the people are seen as actors who comply with rules rather than care for our ecosystems. And this was visible in all the three cases. For example, by framing farmers and foresters as just producers. Many of them, many of the people we spoke to stressed the importance of moving away from this anthropocentric view and also narrow interpretation of nature and biodiversity. And in the Belgian case, people expressed this worry that a nature-based healthcare might even further commodify nature. And then the other dynamic we saw is that this dominant framing of producer being the main role. I think there's someone unmuted. Can everyone check if their microphones are off? Thank you. So the other dynamic that we saw is where this dominant framing of producer, it overlooks and fails to support the people and those who are already stewards of nature, or those who are trying to make the transition to becoming a steward. And this currently means financial support often flows to the biggest producers, but also that stewardship practices remain unrecognized in the legal text, and therefore don't exist. So this is where institutional recognition of stewardship roles becomes transformative, mainly because it does two things. First of all, it articulates a clear vision of who do we want to see more of in this transition, and this could also inspire others to reimagine their practices and their roles. And secondly, it helps align institutions with their vision by recognizing and providing more tailored support to those actors that are already aligning with the future we have in mind, by getting rid of mismatches in legislation, for example, or by legitimizing or even incentivizing new steward practices. And so then we have our final recommendation, which builds directly on everything we have discussed so far. So across our three cases, the Finnish, Belgian, and Dutch case, we don't see justice clearly defined upfront, not in terms of distributive measures, not in terms of responsibility, and not in terms of what fair outcomes we would like to see. So like acknowledging that there will be winners and losers. Instead, justice is something that's worked out in practice over time through negotiation between actors and experimentation with policy instruments. In other words, justice is highly contextual. It looks different depending on the place, its actors, the histories that are there, and the ecological conditions. And of course we're talking about systems in transitions, and so we're moving from an old system to a new system, and contestation cannot be avoided in this process. These biodiversity transitions will change how land is used, who benefits, who carries the costs, and much more. This also means that there will not be pure win-win solutions. There will be differences in viewpoints and disagreements, or non-violent conflict, and it's all part of the process. And so what we see in the cases, but also in our broader experiences in transition governance, is that most governance processes are not well equipped to deal with this. The policies are designed to maintain stability, smooth implementation, and often avoid the conflict that I just talked about. As a result, they tend to struggle with these components and they are just part of this just transition process. So our final recommendation is to acknowledge that just transitions are contextual and contested, and to design governance processes that can accommodate that. This means to ensure spaces where constructive and legitimate conflict and disagreement can take place. It means opening up participation to become a social learning process instead of this illusion of inclusion. But also to treat justice as an explicit goal of transitions. But yeah, one that still requires negotiation and discussion. Yeah, and then briefly returning to what this analysis set out to do. So across these 3 cases, we analyzed how they understand and operationalize justice in biodiversity transitions. What we see is that justice is rarely articulated, operationalized indirectly, tends to shadow frontrunners. And in the process of talking about justice, we tend to shy away from disagreement and conflict. These 4 recommendations are definitely not meant as a checklist, but responses to real tensions that we found in the cases that we explored. Yeah, and taken together, these 4 recommendations point to a different way of thinking about biodiversity transitions, not just as nature and biodiversity issues needing a solution, but as a political and social processes where values, responsibilities, and our futures are negotiated. And yeah, this was everything I wanted to tell you about our findings. If you would like to know more or stay updated on briefs and other materials that we publish based on this work, do reach out to us, either by sending one of us a direct email, which you can find here, or by subscribing to our BIONEXT newsletter. And then I'm going to hand the work back to Aniek.
Yeah, thanks, Symke. Thank you so much. And if in the meantime, I see people clapping, if in the meantime questions arise, then you can already drop them in the chat. But like I mentioned at the beginning, we will have a more specific Q&A session towards the end. But before we do that, I am very happy to say that we're joined by Lara Sibbing and Ida Simonsen, who kindly agreed to be our panel members and to reflect on the work that Symke just presented. So a big welcome to Lara Sibbing. Lara Sibbing works on a fair economy and a clean food system. She holds a PhD in food policy and currently works as an independent advisor, speaker, and writer. And she has also been a Greens Labour candidate in the European and in the recent Dutch national elections. Welcome, Lara.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. And Ida Simonsen. Ida Simonsen is an agroecological farmer at a community-supported agriculture project on the outskirts of Amsterdam. And on top of that, she is an organizer, among other initiatives. She's active as a policy coordinator for Dutch Farmers Association Toekomstboeren, which is connected to La Via Campesina and the broader agroecological movement. Welcome, Ida. Thank you so much to both of you for being here and for sharing your time and expertise with us. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that we can see each other, which is perhaps a little nicer. And yeah, so in the beginning, we asked everybody what came to mind, what they thought about the words justice in biodiversity transitions. And I thought maybe this is also a nice way for you to introduce yourself and also what you do. So could you briefly introduce yourself and share what justice means from where you sit in your work or daily practice? And let's start with Lara.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I think you gave me, you introduced me very well, Aniek, already. So I guess people have an image of what I do and where I come from. The first thing that came to mind, also seeing the title of this webinar, to me is, and it's something that I've learned over the last couple of years, both in politics and in research, is that there's a very big difference between being right and getting it right. And if you say that in Dutch, it even makes more sense, but gelijk hebben en gelijk krijgen. But in English, it basically works the same, that for a lot of things, and I guess that's also the case for justice and biodiversity transformations, we know more or less through research what needs to be done. But actually having the system doing that and all the people that need to act, that being politicians, that being researchers, that being campaigners, civil servants, that is often the biggest challenge. And that's a totally different sport, how to develop and how to find out the things that we need to do and come up with good plans and actually make people engage and make people move. And so that's the first thing that came to mind also when I saw the title and when I listened to what Symke was just presenting, that there's so much importance that we need to give to the narrative, to the wording, to the language. And one of the things that I learned is, for example, just as in biodiversity transformations, there's a lot of nouns in there and relatively few verbs. So you're talking about very big abstract concepts that are not moving, they're very still. Whereas if we talk about humans or actors that need to do something for things that are just and for the changes that we can see in daily lives and practice, those are words that actually move people. So this is one of the first things that came to mind.
Yeah, thanks. A very nice reflection. And indeed, our title is very static, which contradicts some of our own insights of justice being a process. So thanks for that, Lara. Ida, so what came to mind for you? And could you also introduce yourself briefly and how, yeah, what justice means to you in your daily practice?
Honestly, I don't think I can introduce myself any better than you already did, Aniek. I also have to echo Lara on that. You were very complete in your introduction. Yeah, and what follows from that is that I'm also working on food systems. I think my primary connection to the living world around us and biodiversity questions I access through my farming practices. And I was part of a really inspiring gathering with agroecological activists in October. And as a group, we were trying to find words in many different languages around concepts of justice within agroecological transformation. And yeah, we spilled many words and we tried our best. And I think we inspired one another. But at one point, my a comrade from Mexico and an activist called Diana said, "Justice is living well on the land," and the whole room fell silent because there was just no better way of putting that. I think justice is living well, and what that looks like, I think, as your research recommendations also highlighted, is deeply contextual, which also brings to mind one of the credos of the Zapatista movement, which is we want a world in which many worlds are possible. And that also very deeply relates to kind of a multi-species vision for justice. So justice is not just something human-centered, but something that innately recognizes that we can't be well on the land without caring for fellow nature and for the many other living beings on who our lives depend, and the other way around, right? Like the ways that we can take care of others, human and otherwise. And that brings me to take my last 2 points on this. I think when we talk about biodiversity and justice, there's a tendency to focus on redistributive justice, which is great, right? Because we need to focus on the redistribution of power and capital, because without a proper transformation, so not just a transition to the next phase of capitalism, no, a transformation, there will be no justice, right? But then there's also the contributive element, and we tend to forget about that. Just the joy of being able to contribute to economies of care and solidarity. I think we really, we need to highlight that. That's also where the practice and the verb, as you said, Lara, comes into play, right? How do we actually do this, and how do we make it something that we actually, something that's worth living for and worth struggling for? And I think there's a whole dimension of empowerment there. It's not just about who gets what and who gets access to what. It's about who gets to do what with that access and how they get to feel about that, what they get to actualize through that. So when we talk, for example, about access to land, which is one of the most important issues, if we talk about biodiversity restoration and the roles that different human beings whose stewardship has been neglected for so long, right, have to play in that, it's also about how we get to contribute. That's some of my first initial thinking on that.
Yeah, thanks, Ida. Very spot on. And you already nicely hinted towards essentially our stewardship point, and yeah, as Symke already presented, we really found in kind of policies, especially in policies, that we often frame, yeah, people, land managers as producers, right? Through this old world frame, very economic oriented, which often leads to stewardship practice that already exists to be overlooked, or even people that are kind of eager to make that step. And you are already a steward, right, in your practice at your farm. What do you think would change if this stewardship role would be more formally recognized in policies or kind of institutional kind of recognition? What would that change for you? Or would anything change for you? Or the broader system, perhaps?
That's really hard to say. It really depends on what kind of governance structures we're talking and what specific policies, and for example, subsidy streams that might be related to it. Because something that Symke mentioned in their presentation was the threat of recommodification in these type of revaluation exercises, right? Especially if they're tied to policy frameworks. And that's it's a difficult conversation that I've had, for example, when it comes to issues like the cap subsidy, or biodiversity credits. Some people have asked me also in a public roundtable, like, oh, would you want to be part of this biodiversity credit scheme if we would offer you a deal? And I said no, and it was kind of the woman who asked me was a bit scandalized, but it was kind of a gut reaction, actually. So there's so many ways that I think current policy, but also a lot of policy proposals, things that are being rolled out, potentially with good intentions, but also very often lobbied for by interests that, in my opinion, do not serve justice.
Yeah.
That maybe aim at revaluation of stewardship, but kind of end up not only commodifying what should not be commodified, but also ultimately only strengthening concentrations of power and capital, and actually just leaving people who are paid out, for example, for biodiversity credits with crumbs, while other systems of exploitation and other sites of extraction are being greenwashed by that small payment or maybe a small rollout of a subsidy. So I think this is kind of a long-winded and maybe a little bit of a chaotic answer to your question, but that is also because it's a very, very complex one. There's a lot of risks involved, I think, in the formal recognition of stewardship. And at the same time, I would also agree that it is very important, or rather, I would say that there is no there is no just policy framework for a transformation in how we safeguard our biodiversity without recognizing stewardship. And maybe to get to a little bit more of a concrete point is that I think the language and framework of human rights does provide a lot of guidance in this regard, because it offers us safeguards in terms of what can be done around this theme. So I think a right-centered approach to the recognition of stewardship, for example, when it comes to the issue of access to land, land rights, tenure, I think at least there's something there that can help us in this regard, but it's a very complex issue.
Yeah. We haven't formulated any easy questions for you today. I'm sorry for that, but thank you very much, Ida. What I hear you say very much is that even kind of recognizing the stewardship role kind of risks making another character of it, and that the problem might be more in the way that we do governance at the moment, in the way that we govern our socio-ecological systems. So maybe we can go to Lara, who has a lot of experience in policy, and also particularly in policy that you refer to, like the CAP. How do you see this? Would you see this as a way forward, recognizing stewardship roles, or do you tend to agree with Ida, or what is your take on this?
Yeah, no easy questions, you said. Thank you. Yeah, I very much agree with what Ida is saying, and then I am very interested. I think the concept of stewardship is super important, idealistically, but also practically. But then I'm wondering, okay, how do we get there? Like, what's the first step we take, and how can we actually make that happen? Because I think, like, theoretically, it's super interesting, and a lot is happening also in practice. But I myself live in Brussels at the moment, and if you look at the European Parliament and you know how the seats are divided, I don't think there's a lot of like steward ownership, or stewardship is not very high on the political agenda. So yeah, policy and politics, you can never see them separately. But I think the key, and this is again what I was saying a bit about language and narrative, is also key here, because what people believe is needed and is good, is in their favor, is often very different from what actually is in their favor. And relating that to being a politician or being a voter. So relating that to stewardship, I think for a lot of people, for societies, it would be much better to have a much more equal division of power, and to not exploit the land, and to equalize that a lot better. And I think stewardship is a very good way to take care of both people, ecosystems, humans, etc. The thing is, how do you make, a lot of people would believe, oh, that's something different, or oh, I'm going to lose money, or oh, it's not beneficial. So this is, and that's why it's just some sort of like activist kind of concept. So let's not do that. So there's again a big difference between, having it right and getting it right. And I think that's where we should focus on, like, how can we actually convince people and show that this is something beneficial for all of us. And to do that, you need to talk to the intuition instead of the ratio, instead of the reasoning. And this is something I've been in research as well. I've written a PhD, I worked in research, I've been a consultant. And it was something quite interesting to learn, that actually it's counterintuitive, but to come with the numbers, to come up with the facts, to have a good solid report, is not going to help you very much in convincing people to actually start moving. So the challenge is to actually combine gut feeling and intuition and clear examples and concrete examples with actually those hard facts. And I think this is the challenge that we face as people who would like to improve the world in a broad sense, and that I see over and over again. So yeah, to do that, to combine research results and also speak to people as humans.
Yeah, so to really start telling the stories, some of the good stories that are out there, and we know there's good stories, right, of people being stewards and still having good livelihoods and not painting it as the, I don't know, you're going to be in a financial ruin type of thinking that some farmers might have. But to really narrate these stories, I think that's a very good point. And that was also one of our reasonings behind this recommendation, is that kind of shining a light on stewardship also helps to kind of bring out some of the success stories and kind of the good narratives around that. But you make some very valid points about
I would even maybe go a step further, because I think still also in research and research organizations, the sort of storytelling or narrative is something that is like the icing on the cake. Like, okay, we develop our report, we do our research. Oh, and how do we make it, how do we make people actually read our report? That's where we bring in a bit of storytelling. And in politics, it's even something that you want to stay away from a little bit, because you wouldn't want to get into the emotions. It's not really like you're not being taken serious. Whereas I would say we should flip that 180 degrees and see the beauty of it, because we're not talking to robots. We're not creating algorithms. We're talking to humans. We're operating as humans, as group animals that look at each other. So seeing the beauty of a promise that is going to make people's lives better, and then showing, okay, and this is how, through the concept of stewardship, versus the other way around. Okay, we got this great concept of stewardship with our results. Oh, and by the way, we got this nice story of one farmer to sort of serve it to you and flavor it a little bit. I think we should do it the other way around.
It's a nice challenge for us researchers. I know there's also quite a few researchers here in the room, so thank you for that call to action, Lara. And Lara, maybe to stay with you, I think kind of our final recommendation around kind of like acknowledging that just transitions are contextual and contested, and that contestation is part of it and to some extent unavoidable. You've done quite a lot of campaign work for the Greens, the Labour Greens Labour. So you've encountered people with very different views on agriculture, nature justice, and probably topics beyond that as well. And you even stood across them in debates. So do you recognize this kind of importance of, or the unavoidability of contestation and conflict? And maybe how did you deal with that? And are there maybe some lessons for us that we can bring forward that we can build on?
Yes. Well, my favorite book of all times is The Righteous Mind by Jonathan Haidt. And if you're a researcher working on sustainability and very much into this, please also read something by Jonathan Haidt, because it gives you more insight in values and in humans. And I think that's really a key. So justice is a value, and people have very interpretations of what is just. And so I, as a human or as a politician, have my idea and my concept. Okay, this is a just society. But the people that I've debated with also have their idea of a just society, which is very different. And yeah, this sometimes, or can really create conflict. But it's interesting to think, okay, what is their concept of just, and what are they focusing on and going for, and then try to sort of bring in your own concept of just and relate that, of course, to concrete measures, etc., etc. But you really have to first go for values and intuition, and only then you can come up with really your measures, because otherwise people will just say like, okay, they don't buy it. And I find it even more interesting, maybe because some of the Dutch national politicians that I've debated, they have very clear ideas and have been, they've been saying these things for years and are not doing much else. So it's, you're not going to convince people in one debate. I find it more interesting to talk to people on the street and hear actually things that people repeat that they've heard, for example, if they're read on the internet, and ask like, okay, why do you think this, or where does your information come from? And actually sometimes people completely shift or completely change their mind in one conversation, if it's an open conversation. So yeah, that's quite interesting.
Yeah, so also here very much the difference between I guess the political arena or politics versus kind of governance as just being kind of a process of making sense and taking decisions between people, which obviously is a very different game. Thank you for that.
At the same time, it's the same game, because I sometimes hear, or often hear, the argument like, yeah, but this is just the title of our research report, and if we're going to go to the people or do a debate or a talk, we'll change the language, or no, this is how we present it here, but not there. But in the end, we're all humans. Every policy is made by someone's keyboard and somebody typing or somebody pushing a button. And we're much more the same. Like, if you convince somebody because you manage to touch on someone's values, that works the same everywhere.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point. To start with values rather than the framings or the narratives that you already have talked about a few times. Thank you, Lara. And I see a couple of people being interested in the book that you talked about. It's already going on in the chat, The Righteous Mind by Jonathan Haidt. Maybe a final question, because I'm also eyeing the time. If we were to meet again, all of us in this webinar in 10 years, what would you hope at minimum has changed in terms of how we understand and govern biodiversity transition? So what would be your hope for us as a society 10 years? I'll let that sink in for a little bit. And maybe start with Ida.
Aye. Okay. Another big complicated one.
Sorry.
One that projects us into the future, unless I'm thinking about two things. I hope that in 10 years from now, we'll have stopped pretending that biodiversity transformation, justice-based orientation in policy can be even thought of, let alone put into any stage of implementation, divorced from our macro policy frameworks, especially when it comes to the way we structure our economies, particularly when we think about EU policy and the way we organize ourselves around issues such as trade. I would hope that in 10 years from now, we'll have organized ourselves, we'll have trained ourselves, we'll have exchanged to a state where we refuse to somehow hold these things in two hands and pretend that we're not carrying water in one hand and fire in the other. That's the first part. So where as the EU, we can stop talking about objectives of economic growth and competitive European markets, because ultimately that means destroying people and ecosystems in the majority world. And I would hope that in 10 years from now, we're gonna not just be more honest about that, but that we're putting practices into place to actually change this, and that some has already changed by then. And then secondly, and I think related to this, is I guess what I've just said is a bit of a coloring of kind of this open box we've created together on the concept of justice, right? And I think it's such I think it's really inspiring, and I think it's necessary, and it's very good that you stated, okay, we can't, our recommendations don't stem from a preset definition of justice that then the following steps or processes need to aim at. And at the same time, there's a kind of agnosticism inherent to that, right? And I think there are certain things that I hope, again, in 10 years from now, we'll have stopped being agnostic about. When I do like facilitation in meetings with other agroecological farmers or really anyone, we often start with a community agreement. And the community agreement is with the same aim, like kind of having an emergent, collectively defined process of seeing, okay, what would be just, what would be living well together during the time that we have, and what does it say for further organizing? So it's an open process, but it's not without any borders or frameworks, because we've started from a set of principles that are inherent to what we see as, let's say, agroecological justice. So that means that we are actively working on dismantling racism, patriarchy, ableism, fascism, speciesism. All of that we are already bringing to the table, because we know that we need those principles in order to be an open and inclusive and good participatory space. And we know that we need tools and skills around those themes. So the table isn't empty when people arrive, and we don't pretend it is. And I think in 10 years from now, those kind of, let's call them red lines or principles, I think need to be there in everyone's mind, in everyone's heart, and hopefully in everyone's hands, as everyone in their own way contributes to a justice centered biodiversity transformation strategy. So that's my hope for the next 10 years.
Nice. We have some way to go, but I share your hope in that we can at least set the dial on the compass a little stronger for all of us towards a just world. Lara, how about you?
Well, let me start by saying that I totally agree with what Ida's saying, and in sort of like the general lines, that's something I would really like as well. So let's add by making it a bit more practical and political, maybe. I think it would be great if we could use the momentum that we currently have in this era of political tensions, of increasing political tension, and a focus on autonomy, on sovereignty, and on safety. I think the European Union would be still a very great, a strong level, a strong place to take action. So I would hope that starting soon, and then being able to harvest in 10 years, would be great if we could use the momentum of, okay, we need to focus more on safety, on taking care of ourselves in Europe, by actually using higher standards at the European border, and improving our policies in a way that we're going to take care of ourselves, of our land in Europe, and setting again the examples to other continents, because at the moment we're quite a shitty example in terms of this. Yeah, then actually getting back on a more sustainable, healthy track, and harvesting that in 10 years.
Yeah, I think all of us, or at least all Europeans in the room, would definitely second that. Thanks, Lara.
There's actually also quite a lot of people that say, okay, we should lower standards again, and we should, stop with all this climate stuff. Maybe there's not so many people that have this opinion in this webinar, but I guess the frame of safety, of taking care of ourselves, is a good way to start. In the
exactly.
spectrum.
Safety, security, and well-being that don't necessarily contradict what we've been saying today. and then Trojan horse, socio-ecological justice into it.
Yes.
Thanks for that. I would also like to open a space for questions from the audience. If people have questions, and this could be questions to Symke or me about the research we have done, but it could also be to Lara or to Ida. If you have a question, you can write them in the chat.